The spread of this disease is distressing, to be sure, but we're really not surprised to see the world in the grip of such pestilence, are we? Jesus made it clear at Luke 21:11 that pestilence would be part of the sign of the last day.
For years, millions of Jehovah's Witnesses looked to Stephen Lett as a steady voice of certainty, a man who spoke about hope, faith, and the promise of a better future. But behind the broadcasts and carefully prepared messages, heartbreak was quietly entering his own life. At the same time, the organization he helped lead was facing growing criticism, painful personal stories, legal battles, and a wave of members asking difficult questions. Was this simply another challenge for the Watchtower, or the beginning of something much bigger? Long before millions recognized his face on JW broadcasting, Stephen Lett was simply another full-time Jehovah's Witness minister. Born around 1949, he dedicated much of his adult life to the organization, serving in roles that required constant travel, public speaking, and close work with congregations. Over the years, he became known as a circuit overseer, encouraging local congregations and helping carry out the direction of the Watchtower's leadership. In 1999, his influence grew dramatically when he was appointed to the governing body, the small group of men responsible for providing spiritual direction to Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide. For members, these men are viewed as taking the lead in explaining Bible teachings and guiding the organization's global work. Their talks shape beliefs, organizational policies, and major announcements followed by millions across more than 200 countries. For years, most governing body members remained largely unknown to the public. That changed with the launch of JW Broadcasting in 2014. Suddenly, members around the world were no longer just reading articles or listening to convention recordings. They were seeing their leaders on screen regularly, month after month. Among them, Stephen Lett quickly stood out. His expressive facial movements, dramatic pauses, and animated delivery made him instantly recognizable. Supporters often described his style as warm, memorable, and heartfelt. Outside the organization, however, those same mannerisms became the subject of countless internet memes, parody videos, and social media discussions. Whether admired or criticized, one thing became undeniable. Stephen Lett had become the public face of the modern Watchtower. But becoming the face of a global religious organization also meant becoming the face of its growing controversies. And as the internet expanded, every public statement, every broadcast, and every policy would begin receiving a level of scrutiny that previous generations of leaders never experienced. The real turning point wasn't Stephen Lett's appointment to the governing body. It was the moment the internet gave millions of people the ability to compare the Watchtower's past with its present and ask questions that had never been easier to investigate. For most of the Watchtower's history, information moved in one direction. Members received printed magazines, attended meetings, and listened to convention talks. If someone wanted to research a teaching, they usually relied on the organization's own publications. That system remained largely unchanged for decades. Then, the internet re-ruled the rules. As smartphones became common and search engines improved, people could suddenly compare current teachings with older publications in minutes. Archived Watchtower literature, convention talks, court records, newspaper investigations, and public statements became easier to find than ever before. Questions that once stayed inside private conversations began spreading across YouTube channels, discussion forums, podcasts, and social media. Former members found something many said they had never experienced before: a global community. Instead of feeling isolated after leaving the religion, they could share their stories with thousands of others who had lived through similar experiences. Some described finding support. Others used these platforms to criticize organizational policies and compare personal experiences. Supporters of the Watchtower saw the internet very differently. They argued that online platforms were filled with misinformation, selective editing, and voices determined to weaken the faith of sincere believers. The organization repeatedly encouraged members to be cautious about material produced by critics and former members, warning that not everything online could be trusted. The result was two completely different narratives unfolding at the same time. One side believed the internet was exposing information that had been difficult to access. The other believed it had become a powerful tool for spreading confusion and attacking the organization. Caught in the middle was Stephen Lett, whose monthly broadcasts now reached not only devoted witnesses, but also critics, journalists, researchers, and millions of curious viewers around the world. Then, one sentence spoken during a global crisis would become one of the most debated statements of his entire ministry. Then, one sentence spoken during a global crisis would become one of the most debated statements of his entire ministry. In early 2020, as the world struggled to understand the COVID-19 pandemic, Stephen Lett delivered a message that would soon spread far beyond Jehovah's Witnesses. Speaking during a governing body update, he declared that the world was living in the final part of the last days, shortly before the last day of the last days. For believing witnesses, the message reinforced a teaching they'd heard for generations. The end of this system could come at any time, making spiritual priorities more important than ever. Many found comfort in the reminder that, despite fear and uncertainty, they believed God remained in control. Outside the organization, however, the reaction was very different. Critics quickly shared the clip across YouTube, social media, and discussion forums. Some argued that the statement encouraged members to believe that world events were unmistakable signs that Armageddon was extremely close. As the pandemic eased and everyday life gradually returned, those critics revisited the video, asking whether the language had created expectations that were never fulfilled. Supporters pushed back against that criticism. They argued that Stephen Lett had not set a date for Armageddon or claimed the pandemic itself would bring the end. Instead, they viewed his words as an expression of urgency, consistent with long-standing Jehovah's Witness beliefs that Christians should always remain spiritually prepared because no one knows the exact day or hour. The debate became bigger than a single sentence. It reflected two completely different ways of interpreting the same message. One side saw a passionate call to stay faithful. The other saw another example of end-times language that had become increasingly difficult to reconcile with the passing of time. But that wasn't the only issue drawing attention to the Watchtower. While this debate unfolded online, another controversy, far more serious and far more personal, was already making headlines around the world. While discussions about prophecy continued online, another issue was bringing Jehovah's Witnesses into courtrooms and international headlines. This time, the focus was not on predictions about the future. It was on how the organization handled allegations of child sexual abuse. Over the years, lawsuits and government investigations in several countries examined whether the Watchtower's internal procedures adequately protected children. One of the most widely discussed inquiries was the Australian Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, which reviewed how many organizations, including Jehovah's Witnesses, responded to abuse allegations. A major point of criticism centered on the organization's two-witness rule. Based on its interpretation of certain Bible passages, Jehovah's Witnesses generally require either a confession or two witnesses before a congregation judicial committee can establish certain serious wrongdoing for internal religious discipline. Critics argued that child abuse often happens in private, making that standard difficult to meet and potentially discouraging victims from feeling heard within the congregation. The organization responded that this policy does not prevent victims or their families from reporting abuse to the police. Jehovah's Witnesses have stated that elders seek to comply with reporting laws where they apply, and that victims have the right to contact secular authorities. They also point to updates made to guidance over the years and reject claims that they protect abusers as organizational policy. Stephen Lett became part of this broader debate through his role as a member of the governing body. In one public talk, he dismissed claims that Jehovah's Witnesses shield child abusers as apostate-driven lies and dishonesties. Supporters viewed his comments as a defense against what they considered false accusations. Critics argued they minimized the experiences of abuse survivors and discouraged open discussion. As legal cases continued and media attention grew, many observers began asking an even more difficult question. If child protection wasn't the only issue dividing opinion, what role did one of the organization's most controversial practices, shunning, play in why so many families say their lives changed forever? For many people outside Jehovah's Witnesses, no teaching generates more emotion than the practice commonly known as shunning. Inside the organization, the term most often used is disfellowshipping, or more recently in some contexts, removal from the congregation. While the terminology has evolved, the debate surrounding the practice has remained intense. According to Jehovah's Witness teachings, a baptized member who commits serious wrongdoing and refuses to repent may be removed from the congregation. Members are taught to limit or avoid unnecessary association with that person, believing this follows biblical instruction and helps protect the congregation's spiritual standards. The organization also teaches that the discipline is intended to encourage repentance and eventual restoration. Stephen Lett has publicly defended this teaching, describing it as an expression of loyalty to God rather than an act of cruelty. Official Watchtower publications similarly present disfellowshipping as a loving form of discipline designed to help individuals recognize the seriousness of their actions and return to the faith. Former members often describe the experience very differently. Many have shared emotional stories of losing regular contact with parents, children, siblings, lifelong friends, and entire support networks after leaving or being disfellowshipped. Some say the emotional impact lasted for years, while others explain that rebuilding relationships outside the organization became one of the most difficult parts of their lives. These personal accounts have attracted growing media attention, with documentaries, journalists, and advocacy groups questioning the psychological effects of enforced social separation. At the same time, many active Jehovah's Witnesses continue to defend the practice, saying difficult religious standards have always been part of biblical faith, and that obedience sometimes requires painful sacrifices. The disagreement has become one of the defining public debates surrounding the Watchtower. For supporters, it reflects commitment to Scripture. For critics, it represents one of the main reasons people choose not to return. Yet, while the world focused on policy and controversy, Stephen Lett himself was quietly facing a deeply personal tragedy that few people outside the organization fully understood. To many viewers, Stephen Lett is known for his energetic speaking style, expressive facial expressions, and monthly appearances on JW Broadcasting. But away from the cameras, he was facing a deeply personal struggle that he rarely discussed in public. During a convention introduction, Stephen Lett revealed that his wife, Susan Lett, had been living with dementia. For many Jehovah's Witnesses, it was a rare glimpse into the private life of one of the organization's most recognizable leaders. Members who had listened to him encourage others through grief and hardship now learned that he was experiencing those same challenges at home. Not long afterward, reports spread that Susan had passed away. In later public remarks, Stephen Lett spoke about the Christian hope of the resurrection, a belief central to Jehovah's Witness teachings, and expressed confidence that he would see his wife again. Even many of his critics acknowledged the personal pain behind those comments, separating his private loss from the broader debates surrounding the organization. At the same time, social media filled with new speculation. Some online users claimed Stephen Lett himself appeared to be suffering from dementia, Parkinson's disease, or another neurological condition, often pointing to his age, facial expressions, or speaking mannerisms as evidence. Despite how widely these claims circulated, no credible public evidence or official medical information has confirmed any of those rumors. To date, they remain speculation, not established fact. Another painful story also resurfaced online: the widely discussed death of Stephen Lett's nephew, who had reportedly left Jehovah's Witnesses before his death. Critics have linked this tragedy to wider discussions about shunning and family relationships, while many details remain based on family accounts and public reporting rather than official statements from the organization. As sympathy for Stephen Lett's personal struggles grew, an even bigger question remained unanswered. If this wasn't just about one man, why were so many people rethinking their relationship with the Watchtower in the first place? For decades, Jehovah's Witnesses were known for steady growth, organized preaching, and a strong sense of unity. Members often believed they belonged to a global family with a clear purpose and a unique understanding of the Bible. But in recent years, more people have begun asking whether that picture is changing, and if so, why? The answer depends on who you ask. Former members often point to a combination of factors rather than a single event. Many say the internet allowed them to compare current teachings with older publications, research court cases, read experiences from other former witnesses, and access information that had once been difficult to find. Others describe struggling with policies surrounding disfellowshipping, higher education, blood transfusions, or the handling of abuse allegations. For some, it wasn't one issue that led them to leave. It was the accumulation of many unanswered questions. The organization sees the situation differently. Jehovah's Witnesses have long taught that opposition, criticism, and people leaving the faith were foretold in the Bible and should not surprise faithful Christians. They continue to report millions of active members worldwide and emphasize their global preaching work, humanitarian relief efforts, and ongoing Bible education as evidence that the organization remains spiritually strong. Independent observers note that the picture is complex. In some countries, Jehovah's Witness membership has remained relatively stable, while in others there have been declines, aging congregations, or changing patterns of religious participation that mirror broader societal trends. Like many religious organizations, the Watchtower faces challenges that vary from one region to another. What is clear is that the conversation has changed. Questions that once remained inside kingdom halls are now debated across the internet, where supporters, critics, journalists, scholars, and former members all contribute their own perspectives. But if today's challenges are unlike anything the organization has faced before, what does that mean for its future, and for the man who has become its most recognizable public face? Every major religious movement eventually reaches a moment when the world around it changes faster than its traditions. For Jehovah's Witnesses, many observers believe that moment arrived with the rise of the digital age. In previous generations, most members experienced the organization through meetings, conventions, printed literature, and conversations within their local congregations. Today, a single smartphone can provide access to decades of Watchtower publications, archived broadcasts, court decisions, academic research, investigative documentaries, and thousands of personal stories from both current and former witnesses. Whether someone leads them to strengthen their faith or question it often depends on which sources they trust. The Watchtower has responded by expanding its own digital presence. JW Broadcasting, the official website, the JW Library app, and translated content in hundreds of languages have allowed the organization to reach millions more efficiently than ever before. From the leadership's perspective, technology has become a powerful tool for spreading Bible teachings across the globe. Critics argue that the same technology has also made it harder for the organization to control the narrative. Public statements can now be replayed years later. Policy changes can be compared side by side with older publications. Court cases are searchable. Former members can speak directly to global audiences instead of only to close friends or family. Stephen Lett has become the symbol of this new era, not because he created every policy, but because his face, voice, and broadcasts have come to represent the organization during one of its most closely examined periods. History shows that religions often adapt, sometimes gradually and sometimes under intense pressure. The real question is not whether the Watchtower is facing challenges. It clearly is. The question is how those challenges will shape the organization in the years ahead. And that brings us to the most important question of all, one that neither critics nor supporters can answer with certainty. For some people, Stephen Lett will always be remembered as a faithful leader who stood firm during one of the most challenging periods in the modern history of Jehovah's Witnesses. They see a man who spent decades preaching, comforting believers, and encouraging millions to remain focused on what they believe is God's promise for the future. Even through the heartbreaking loss of his wife, he continued speaking publicly about hope, endurance, and the resurrection. For others, Stephen Lett has become the public face of deeper questions surrounding the Watchtower. They point to legal challenges, criticism of organizational policies, changing public perception, and the growing influence of the internet as evidence that the organization is entering a new chapter unlike any before it. In their view, information that was once difficult to access is now available to almost anyone willing to search. What cannot be denied is that the conversation has changed. Today, supporters defend the organization online just as passionately as critics challenge it. Every public talk is analyzed, every policy update is debated, every major legal decision is reported around the world within hours. Whether someone sees that as an attack on their faith or as greater transparency often depends on where they stand. The future of the Watchtower will not be decided by a single speech, a single lawsuit, or even a single leader. It will be shaped by how the organization responds to an age where information travels instantly, questions spread globally, and every generation examines long-held beliefs through a different lens. Stephen Lett remains one of the most recognizable voices in that story. But perhaps the bigger story was never about one man. It's about what happens when conviction, tradition, technology, and transparency collide, and whether one of the world's most recognizable religious organizations can adapt to a world where every claim, every policy, and every decision is only a click away. Because if the last few years have changed the Watchtower this much, what might the next few years reveal?